Welcome to Global Tax Talks, Tax in 60 Seconds. I'm Will Morris, and here are some things to watch out for in the coming week. It's often hard to discern a tipping point, the moment things change, until well after the event. But it's possible last week may have been the tipping point for the OECD. First, there was a statement issued on Pillar 1 that basically said everything's going great, we're just a couple of countries away from agreement, etc., etc. But the reality is that Pillar 1 has stopped moving, and unresolvable differences make it unlikely to ever move again. And time is not the OECD's friend here, especially with a new and decidedly sceptical US administration coming in. That point was made clear by Scott Bessent, President-elect Trump's nominee for Treasury Secretary, at his confirmation hearing in the US Senate last Thursday with respect to Pillar 2. Asked by a senator about his message to other countries implementing Pillar 2, Mr. Bessent said, "Any country that in the next few days before Trump takes office that's intent on implementing Pillar 2 will find it a grave mistake. Taxation of US companies," he said, "is a sovereign issue. That authority lies with Congress." And Mr. Bessent said that he would work with Congress to undo what he termed this terrible policy. Last week, the OECD put out over 300 pages of updated and new guidance relating to Pillar 2. This included guidance on the so-called integrity rules under Article 9.1 of the Model Rules, a list of countries with temporarily qualified domestic minimum top-up taxes, an updated Global Information Return, or GIR, plus commentary, and an XML schema, among other things. Now, it's obviously not the first time that the OECD has released extensive guidance on Pillar 2. So why might last week's guidance be a tipping point for Pillar 2? Well, really it's the substance of the documents released. The GIR guidance emphasizes how unbelievably complex this project is, and to what end? Top-up tax in a few countries? Every time OECD guidance is released, it is more prescriptive slash stricter than the last time. In the case of the GIR, for example, the OECD has now stated that it must be completed according to its model rules, not local country legislation, which truly calls into question the notion of tax sovereignty. And if there are differences between the model rules and local country legislation, then affected groups must report the impact of those differences in the GIR, adding yet another level of complexity and reporting. Again, to what end? On Model Rule 9.1, which contains transitional rules for items of deferred tax, last week's release requires certain benefits, in this case deferred tax assets, to be disregarded for Pillar 2 when the OECD deems an inappropriate advantage to have been gained. But we're nowhere near the end of this, and the OECD announced it will continue work in this area to identify and root out other inappropriate benefits, including from investment promotion agencies and subnational governments, that seek to incentivize taxpayers, including by the provision of benefits such as tax credits or government grants. This is extraordinarily broad and seems intended to stop any use of incentives, however beneficial a sovereign nation might believe them to be. But what makes this guidance most baffling is that it was released 5 days before a new US president is sworn in. The incoming administration and Congress have made their views quite clear. In those circumstances, despite the OECD having been warned publicly and privately, including by members of Congress not to rush this through right now, they went ahead. Wouldn't a pause have been sensible or even respectful? And to be clear, I'd say the same were this a new government in Germany or France or wherever. I think this was a mistake. So, might last week's guidance, both in substance and the questionable timing, be the tipping point at which doubts by other countries about Pillar 2 at last outweigh their confidence in it? If it is that tipping point, then significant aspects of P2 might be reconsidered around, for example, the issue of credits and incentives, as well as the major changes to the UTPR, and perhaps other areas. We'll see, but the weather definitely seems to be changing. Anyway, thanks for joining, and come back next week so that you stay global tax ready.